Welcome everyone to another Pine Bush Science Lecture. I'm Richard Naylor from the Friends of the Pine Bush community, and we co-sponsor with Commission staff our monthly science lecture webinars. As questions occur to you, and some of you've already found it, you can use the Q&A, and that's a great way to feed us questions that then we can go through at the end. Our program today is Bees of the Pine Bush. But just to help you out also with that Q&A, just in case you don't see it, sometimes you have to put your cursor at the bottom and then it shows up. And if you have an iPad, you might have to swipe up. Looking ahead, our February 18th program will be Winter Climate Change in Northeastern Forests. In our region, the climate has been changing even faster in the winter than in the rest of the year. A lot of different things going on there. And that's causing fundamental ecological changes. Our lecturer will be Dr. Colin Foos, Assistant Professor of Environmental Science at State University of New York at Plattsburgh. But now back to today's program, Bees of the Pine Bush. Our speaker, who often introduces the speaker, but today is the speaker, is our very own Amanda Dillon. She grew up in farm country in northern central New York, and she was catching salamanders as a youth, collecting cicada skins, raising monarchs and caterpillars, identifying trees with her dad, and listening to bird songs with her mom. Her love of nature has carried over into her career, earning her a Bachelor's of Science in Natural History and Interpretation from the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry. After spending a summer studying dragonflies and damselflies, she decided to pursue a graduate degree studying insects. She worked with Dr. Barb Hager and earned a Master's of Science degree in entomology. She studied native solitary bees and wasps. She started as a seasonal at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve in 2010, and now as field ecologist and entomologist, she conducts field research, collecting data on a number of research and monitoring projects, while engaging the public in science through the Albany Pine Bush Community Science Program and our very own science lecture series. So with that, I turn it back to Dillon. Dillon.
Thanks so much, Richard. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining me tonight. Bees are kind of my jam. I like talking about them. So, and hopefully after the lecture this evening, you'll have learned something new. And if nothing else, you'll have my contact information if you have any questions or you have any bees you need help identifying. We're going to start today with a poll. So Wendy, if you wouldn't mind putting up the poll, I'm just curious from our audience, how many species of bees do you think I have found in the pine bush? So you can just go ahead and click one of those 4 options and then hit submit. Wendy, can you see if they're coming in?
Yes.
Awesome.
Just let me know when you want to end the polling.
Okay. How many do you have?
We're close to everybody.
All right. Let's call it. Will it show the results?
Can you see it?
I can't.
Okay. So nobody said 10. We have 7 people who said 32. 11 people said 75, and 14 people said 174.
Oh, there it is. Polling results. All right. Not too shabby, guys. Nobody thought it was 10. Well done. I will reveal how many species I have found in the pine bush towards the middle of the presentation. So hold on to that idea while thinking about what you said. Okay. So I want to go over today what I'm going to talk about with you. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight. First, we're going to talk about why bees. So why does anybody care about bees? I mean, I know why I care about bees, but why does anybody else, and why should other people care about bees? And then in order to talk about bees, we got to be on the same page, have the same understanding of what a bee is. So we're going to talk about what the difference between bees and wasps is. And we're also going to talk about social versus solitary. And don't worry if that's kind of doesn't make sense right now. Hopefully it will after we get through that section. And then I'm going to introduce you to the major families of bees that can be found in our area. And then I'm going to talk about some bee research that I've conducted and research that's ongoing in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with what bees need. So ways that you can provide for bees in your own backyard. So pollination. So we're going back to basics here. Pollination is what happens when pollen is moved from one flower to another. And that needs to happen in order for that plant to produce seed or to produce fruit. And for many flowering plants, that is mediated by pollinators. So that can be insects like bees, beetles, flies, butterflies, moths, but it can also even be some birds and mammals. So hummingbirds and bats are also pollinators. But insects pollinate about 75% of the world's angiosperms, which is just a fancy way of saying flowering plants. So we've been trying to estimate the economic value of that, both because some of those flowering plants produce food that we eat, but also produce food that other animals eat, livestock eat, and also enrich the world around us. So how do we put an economic value to that service? And in 2010, Porto et al. Came up with this number of 195 to 387 billion US dollars is the economic yearly value of this pollination service. And even plants that don't require insect pollination can have experienced greater seed set or size of fruit when they are insect pollinated, especially because of that cross pollination. It makes more viable seeds. So much of what we're eating, McGregor estimated back in 1976 that between 15 to 30% of the US diet is either directly or indirectly the result of animal-mediated pollination. So 1 in every 3 bites that you're eating that's on your plate is the result of animal pollination. And so this is just some common stuff that you might have realized was the result of pollination, but some other things that are very important to people that maybe you weren't so aware of are coffee. Coffee is pollinated by bees in South America, and chocolate, which is very important to me. So our palate would be significantly decreased if we didn't have these animals providing this service for us. And especially here and a lot of other areas, that agricultural service has kind of been put on the back of one animal, and that is the European honeybee. This species was introduced in North America in the 1600s. It's now found on every continent except Antarctica. So this animal has made it across the globe. It was originally brought here for honey and wax, so it wasn't really even used for the pollination services much. When it was brought here originally, and the American Indians called it white man's fly. And it was we started after that to use it for this agricultural reason to help pollinate our crops. And so for this reason, for the fact that we are getting products from them, we're using them to provide these services, I like to think of honeybees more as livestock. But that's a problem when we put all of our eggs in one basket like that. We're depending on this one species to provide this huge, huge economic service for us in pollination. It's going to become a real problem if something happens to that animal. And that's exactly what's happening with the European honeybee. Across the globe, it's experiencing what is called colony collapse disorder. And honeybees have been experiencing just regular old decline since the 1950s. But especially in the mid to late 2000s, we were having beekeepers reporting up to 75% losses. And what happens with colony collapse disorder is basically these are social animals. When a bee gets sick, they don't want to bring that disease back to the colony. And so they just won't return to the colony. So what we're finding is happening is that overnight, 75% of the colony is deciding not to return to the nest. And so overnight, you can have a full colony of thousands of individuals now down to just a few hundred. Now, scientists are still unsure about what causes colony collapse disorder. It's probably all of these things working together. They have been fighting mites. You may have heard of the varroa mite and disease that the mite transfers. They've been dealing with that for a long time. But more recently, they may have poor nutrition because they're being forced to feed on these monocultures. So what we're doing is we're taking these hives of honeybees and we're shipping them around the country. And, you know, when the almonds need pollinating, they're stacked and left by the almonds. And when the apples need pollinating, they're shipped over to the East Coast and they're put by the apples. And so what that means is they've got one thing to feed on because we have such huge acres and acres, hundreds of acres of these things. And so they're not really getting a lot of good nutrition from what they're eating. So that could be affecting their ability to fight off of these diseases or defend themselves from these mites. And of course, also pesticides. We're finding more and more that pesticides, especially neonicotinoids, are really affecting our bee community. Not that they're applied to the bees to control the bees, but they're having these non-target effects on the bees, and it's affecting their ability. It can kill them outright, or it affects their ability to fight off disease, or as we're starting to see, it can affect their gut flora. So this is, you know, it's not really a great strategy to have all of your eggs in one basket and depending on this one species. But the good news is that we have a whole suite of native pollinators. These animals have been around for a long, long time, and they are capable of doing this pollination service. So there are 20,000 described bee species globally, and many of those are known to visit crop plants. So native bees are estimated to be responsible for $3.7 billion of fruits and vegetables in the USA. And that doesn't even include the indirect benefits of pollination of foods that cattle eat, like alfalfa. So without domestic pollinators, native bees can pollinate crops when certain environmental conditions are met, and more research, such as this study by Winfrey et al. In Pennsylvania, looking at watermelons, is finding that our native bees can pick up the slack in the absence of honeybees and successfully pollinate the crop, resulting in the same number of fruit and the same size of fruit. And in some cases, our native bees are actually better pollinators than the honeybees. So these two flowers here, you may recognize. The purple one is alfalfa, and alfalfa has a very specific mechanism in the flower. So the bees are after both pollen and nectar, and some of the flowers make them work for it, because what's really important is that they're moving this pollen from flower to flower. And so in the case of the alfalfa, what happens is the bee goes into the flower to get to the nectar reward, and in the process trips a little mechanism in the flower that actually bops the anther, which is the part of the flower that has the pollen. It bops the bee on the head. And so now the bee has that pollen, and when it goes into the next flower, it will transfer it from its head. It turns out that honeybees don't trip that mechanism, so they are not very good pollinators of alfalfa. Same here with this other flower you may recognize is a tomato. So these are the anthers here, excuse me, that are holding onto that pollen. And those anthers need to be vibrated at a certain frequency in order for the anthers to actually drop the pollen. That's called buzz pollination. And honeybees are not so good at it. In fact, the only ones that are really good at it are the bumblebees. So we really need the bumblebees. Anytime you have a tomato, you can thank a bumblebee, because they are the ones that do this buzz pollination that actually causes the pollen to come off of the anthers, so that the plants can be pollinated. So we've got these native pollinators. In New York State, we've got 400 species of native bees that have been found in New York State. There's over 3,500 species in North America. And so there's the possibility of leaning more on our native pollinators. And in addition to what they are directly giving us in the form of chocolate and coffee, they're also providing these important ecosystem services. They're important in these food web dynamics. You know, they're prey for a lot of things, but they're also maintaining the floral resources for a lot of other animals, and also important in ecosystem maintenance in that way. But just like our honeybees, our pollinators are also in decline. And again, it is really hard to put a finger on exactly what's causing it, but it's believed that the greatest threat to insects is habitat degradation and fragmentation. So habitat degradation is just that their habitat is disappearing. Where they once could survive, they can't any longer. You know, it could be it could be a parking lot, it could be someone's front lawn that they're really working on maintaining that nice 4 inches of green grass. Fragmentation is an issue because, you know, bees need floral resources, so they're getting the nectar and the pollen, and they also need a place to nest. If those two resources are too far apart, then they don't have everything that they need to survive. So a lot of times that's what happens is with the fragmentation is that their floral resources are getting separated too far away from their nesting resources. Invasive species are also a problem. So this can go both ways. Kumba et al. In 1999 conducted a study on invasive plants versus native plants as resources for bees. And they kind of hypothesized that invasives would have evolved with a different suite of pollinators, so they would be less accessible to our native pollinators. And it turns out that is the case sometimes, but other times these non-native species, invasive plant species, have a very generalist pollen or flower structure. And so it is accessible to our native species, but maybe less nutritious. So that's why some invasive species can sometimes be really successful when they move here, because not only are their suite of predators or parasites or herbivores missing, they also are readily available to species here that can help them out. But of course, also same with the honeybee, pesticide use is a problem. So these are 2 neonicotinoids, imidacloprid and clothianidin, that are bad for bees. They're really bad for bees. And again, I mentioned before, they can be directly bad. So you may have read about, I think it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, there was a huge die-off of bumblebees in a parking lot at just like a department store out west. And they couldn't figure out why all these bees had died. And then they realized that they had sprayed the linden trees, and they're spraying the linden trees for pest insects that are going to eat the flowers or eat the leaves and possibly kill the trees. But they sprayed it right when those flowers were blooming. So the flowers opened up and had just been coated with this neonicotinoid, and all the bees fed on that. And they just got a straight hard dose of that pesticide and they died. But there are also non-target effects. So, I mean, even back in the 1970s, scientists were seeing that when they sprayed pesticides to control spruce budworm, which, you know, a tree, they were seeing non-target effects at blueberry farms. They were seeing decreased activity at blueberry farms from bees. So, you know, it has kind of these far-reaching effects that we're still realizing now. And also, speaking of far-reaching effects that we're just starting to realize, disease, and specifically disease transmission from managed pollinators. So this can be from honeybees. We also do commercially manage a bumblebee, the common eastern bumblebee, specifically for tomatoes, actually. But in most cases, when we commercially manage these pollinators, they have total access to the habitat around them. So what happens is they're concentrated, or they're traveling from a place where there's a disease and bringing that disease to a new area that's novel to the native population of bees there, and they have no defense against it. So this is actually one of the theories for the decline of the rusty patch bumblebee. That was a species that was ubiquitous in the eastern United States. It was probably one of the most common bumblebees in the eastern United States. And now it's extremely difficult to find, but the common eastern bumblebee is very, very common. And that's the one that is commercially raised and used in agriculture for tomatoes. So the thought is that not only were we boosting their numbers artificially because we were raising them and using them in these commercial settings, commercial agricultural settings, but they were also transferring diseases to our native pollinators because they had access to that habitat. And more we're seeing with honeybees as well, that they can leave residues from viruses and bacteria in their guts on flowers that can then be picked up by native pollinators when they visit the flowers after the honeybees. But there is hope. We are starting to realize as a society and politically that this is something that we need to pay attention to, that this is something that's vitally important to us. And so most recently, we just listed our first bee as an endangered species with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that is the rusty-patched bumblebee. That's the one I just mentioned. That was very, very abundant in Eastern North America, and is now can only be found in some very, very small remnant populations. And all the states were tasked with creating these pollinator protection plans, which I think it was assigned towards the end of Obama. So I believe they had 5 years to produce and start putting these plans into action. So I know New York State has been using citizen scientists, and maybe some of you are participating in that study to look at pollinators, the status of pollinators in New York State. So people are working towards it, figuring this out and doing what we need to do to try to keep these animals on the landscape. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and introduce you to our bees and wasps, or sorry, our bees, but I wanted to start by differentiating bees and wasps and talking about solitary versus social. So here is kind of a typical wasp. Now I'm going to tell you that some easy ways to tell these apart, but you should know that there are some wasps that look like bees and there are some bees that look like wasps. So, you know, in nature, nothing ever goes by the rules. But in general, wasps look largely naked. So they just kind of, they don't have a lot of hairs on them. You can see their legs are very long and slender. And if we bring up our bee here, you can see this bee is very fuzzy. So if you're looking at something real fuzzy, it's more likely to be a bee. Also, if you look at these legs on our bee here, they're really widened and flattened out. So that's also a good indication that it's a bee. This is actually, on this particular bee, that's where they carry pollen. So the legs are expanded to make these little baskets where they carry the pollen. And if you were to look a little bit closer, the definitive way to tell a bee from a wasp is to actually look at the hair. So even though wasps look largely hairless, they do have some hairs on them. But bee hairs are what we call plumose. So they look almost like little shafts of wheat if you were to look at them under a magnifying glass. The wasp hairs are just singular. So it's just like one stalk. So if you have the hairs are branched like that at all, you're looking at a bee. So that's a bee versus a wasp. Now let's talk about social versus solitary, because actually the majority of our bee species are actually solitary. So social, we're talking about honeybees, where there's also some social wasps, yellow jackets, bald-faced hornets. In these situations, there's one queen, and she is doing all of the reproduction. She's laying all of the eggs. So all of the individuals in the colony are her daughters, and they're all sisters, and they're the workers. They're the ones that do all of the work. So once she has a colony established, she's just sitting inside there making more bees. And it's really the rest of these workers that are doing the work for the colony. And they're the ones that are really providing the parental care for the young bees. So you probably familiar with honeycomb. So in a colony, each one of those little combs, those little holes would be, an egg would be laid in there. And when that bee hatched, it would be fed a mixture of pollen and honey, a mixture of pollen and nectar and honey. And it would be regularly fed and waste removed by these worker bees. They can also warm them up by placing their body over them. They can cool them down by fanning them. And so all of that parental care is being provided by the workers of the colony. So in these social situations, yeah, we've got a queen, we have female workers, and we do have male drones, not all the time. And there's usually much, much less male drones than there are female workers. So for the most part, we're looking at all ladies. So Jerry Seinfeld's You Got It So Wrong in Bee Movie. I still refuse to watch that movie. They're all ladies. And what's also really important about this is that the stinger, the business end of the bee, right? That what most people are afraid of, and some people are very allergic to, the venom from, is the stinger. Now, the stinger is actually a modified ovipositor, which an ovipositor is what the female is using to lay eggs. So this is important for two reasons. One, a male does not have an ovipositor, so male bees cannot sting. You can't really tell male bees from female bees a lot of the time. So unless you're an entomologist and you're very familiar with them. But it also means that because all of these workers are not laying eggs, they still have that morphology. They still have that stinger, or that ovipositor, but they're not using it to lay eggs. So now that ovipositor is strictly being used for defense of the colony, which is why social bees are much more aggressive. They're much more likely to sting. They usually have a more painful sting. They have little venom sacs. In some cases in the honeybees, they actually eject that venom sac when they sting you and leave that venom sac pumping venom into you after they actually physically sting you. And that's because they're just a cog, right? They're just a part of a larger organism. And so they're much more likely and willing to sacrifice themselves to save the colony. And so that's going to be in direct contrast to our social bee, or our solitary bees. The solitary bees, the only one providing the parental care is the mother. So there's no workers, there's no drones. So she's the only one caring for her young. And what that means is that she is the only one laying eggs and she's caring for the young. So she's much less likely to sting you because she needs that stinger. She needs that ovipositor because she's laying eggs. She's the one doing the egg laying. So solitary species, while they can aggregate, so you can get them kind of clumping together because they'll use the fact that there's another bee there as an indicator of high quality habitat, right? Like when you're moving somewhere, you can either move some creepy place in the woods where no one is, which actually sounds kind of appealing, or you can move where other people are living. And so you know that it's a safe, good place to live. And that's just what the solitary species are doing. So sometimes it can look like they're swarming, but they're really just aggregating in social or aggregating in suitable habitat. And so those are much, much less likely to sting you. They're much less aggressive. Yeah, you really have to like grab those bees to get them to sting you or give them a reason to sting you, much more so than you have to with the social species. So with our solitary species, the female is going to go find an area for a nest, and it's really going to depend on the species where she's going to find that nest. Some of them nest in the ground, some of them nest in cavities, some of them chew out cavities in our decks and our playgrounds. But she's going to stock that cavity or hole that she digs with a food resource, and it's pollen. She's going to make a little pollen ball. She's going to lay an egg, and then she's going to close off that cell, and that's it. I mean, some solitary bees, the female will go in and she'll remove waste and maybe give them some fresh food, but for the most part, for most of our species, that's all they get. Mom says, here's food for your whole childhood. And that's it. See you later. Bye. So she's going to bury and plug that nest, protect those young. And then that's it. That's the life cycle for these guys. So this is a nest from a leafcutter bee. So this is one that nests in cavities, and they're called leafcutter bees because they cut circles out of leaves, and they'll line that cavity with these leaves. And that kind of protects the nest, protects the larvae inside. And so you can kind of almost see here where these individual cells are. So each one of those has a pollen ball and a larval bee inside of it, all the way to the end, and then she'll close off the end. So yeah, most of our species are actually solitary, and they're going to nest more like this. All right, so now I'm going to move into introducing you to the bee families. We have 6 major bee families that can be found in our area. So I'm going to kind of go over them. Big picture, they're obviously very diverse. So the Andrenids, this is the family Andrenidae. These include mining bees and fairy bees and some other bees that have harder names to say. But these are ground nesting bees. Some of them are specialists. That we find a lot of specialists in this family. So certain bees will only feed on certain plants. So they'll only feed on a family of plants. Some of them will only feed on a particular genus of flowering plants. So a lot of them are found in this group. We have 2 kind of major forms here. These guys are kind of big and robust, fuzzy, yellowish. And then we have these smaller ones. These are ones that look a little bit more wasp-like because they're not quite so fuzzy. They have yellow markings on them. This is one of the fairy bees. But these are all bees that have been found here in the pine bush. They really like sandy soils to nest in. And you can find these guys basically, there's some of the earliest species to come out, but you can find them really late in the season too. And there's a number of different species. The Apidae is a pretty diverse group. So the Apidae actually includes the honeybee. So the honeybee is actually in this family. Also in this family that might be familiar are bumblebees. So bumblebees are also in the Apidae. This one in the middle here might also be familiar. This is the one that makes its nests in your deck and your playground and your porch. This is carpenter bees. They're also in this family. But believe it or not, this is also a carpenter bee, this one down here on the bottom right. It's a small carpenter bee. We have 4 different species. And when I say small, they're about maybe like a 1/4 inch and less. So they're much smaller species. They like to nest in more pithy stems. So you'll find them nesting in like blackberry or raspberry stems or sumac branches. This guy up here, super adorable, is a squash bee. So they are in the Apidae as well. These guys really specialize on the squash plants. So anytime you're eating a curcubit, you can thank a squash bee. Also in this group down here, this is a cuckoo bee, this kind of orange and yellow one. They're so named after the cuckoo birds in Europe. So cuckoo birds in Europe are known for parasitizing the nests of other birds. They go and lay their egg in someone else's nest, and then that bird doesn't realize that they have somebody else's species in their nest, and they end up raising a cuckoo bird instead of their own species. Seems kind of rude, but also I probably would be a cuckoo bird if I was a bird, or a cuckoo bee if I was a bee. So that's what these bees do. They sneak in when the females are away, and they'll lay their eggs. So they're stealing the resources that these other females are gathering. They're taking kind of the easy way out. And these cuckoo bees parasitize, especially the Andrenids. So those big fuzzy Andrenids that we saw on the slide before. Next are our Melidids. These aren't super diverse around here. We have 2 major groups. The yellow-faced bees, again, these are very, very small. So these are going to be less than a 1/4 inch, about 1 centimeter in length. And again, kind of wasp-like. And they're not super fuzzy. And that's because they actually don't carry pollen on the outside of their bodies. They have kind of a crop that they carry the pollen in inside of their mouths. And we also have plaster bees in this group. Now these plaster bees, you can see the pollen being carried on the leg here. Plaster bees are so called because they actually use their spit to kind of make a plaster with the soils that they're nesting in. And they use that to kind of secure the sides of the walls of the nest, but also to kind of waterproof it. So Melidids are some of, especially these plaster bees are some of the earliest that we see, especially here in the pine bush. So if you've ever been out in the pine bush in like real early spring and seen these little sand chimneys alongside the trail, and this is one of those instances where you may think the bees are swarming on the ground, it's probably these Melidids. They're some of our most early species to come out, and again, they're aggregating in that suitable habitat. So, and probably what you're seeing are actually males that are patrolling around on top of those nests looking for females to mate with. So both very common. The Halictidae are the sweat bees. So if I was to guess what people were familiar with, I'd say they were familiar with honeybees, maybe bumblebees, and then this would probably be the third group, would be sweat bees. So these are those little bitty bees that sometimes you find on your arm in the summer. They do actually like to lick the salts from your sweat. So hence they're called sweat bees. This is probably our most diverse group. So we have these big, bright, beautiful race car bees. And then we have these bees. This is a Halictus ligatus. Most of the bees in this group are actually these kind of smaller, kind of metallic, like more of a subdued metallic green. And then we also have parasitic bees in this group as well. So this one here in the middle with this red abdomen is Helicodes. So this is another parasitic species that actually goes in and sneaks into the nests of other halictids and lays her eggs while they're away. So she doesn't actually have to do any work gathering any nectar or anything. This is kind of cool because you see how long the antennae are on this bee. So male bees have one more antennal segment. So you can kind of see here the antenna is divided into segments. The males have one more antennal segment than the females. And sometimes those antennal segments are elongated. And so the males can end up having these very long, this is also a male down here, having these very, very long antennae. So remember before I said, you know, males don't sting. This is one of the ways that you could recognize a male is if it has these really long antennae, and then you don't have to be worried because it can't sting you. These are the megachilids. So this is probably my favorite group of bees. I mean, look at this adorable bee. It just looks like a teddy bear. But these guys, as I mentioned before, they're called leafcutters because they cut little circles out of the leaves, and that's what they line their nest with. Also, you'll notice, we saw in this picture before that most of our other bees are carrying the pollen on their legs. The leafcutter bees carry pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So this is called scopa, these pollen baskets, and it's unique to the leafcutter bees that they have that pollen on the underside of their abdomen, the scopa on the underside of the abdomen. So if you ever see a bee and it's got all that pollen on the underside of the belly like that, you're looking at a leafcutter bee. And this is a picture I took from my parents' garden just this past summer. This is what it looks like when you've got a leafcutter bee nesting nearby somewhere. They cut these little circles right into the leaves, and then they'll carry that back to the nest. Also in this group are the mason bees. So these are also cavity nesters, but they'll line their nests and use mud to construct their nests more so than leaves. And they're usually this kind of dark blue-green metallic color. And also in this group, another parasite. This is Coleoxys. And you'll notice she has this really, really pointed abdomen. And that's so that she can stab into those nests that are created by other leafcutter bees. So when they put the leaf over the end, you know, to close off a cell or to close off the end of the nest, Coleoxys can come in and use that very pointed abdomen to break into that nest and lay the egg. So got parasites everywhere. Our final group here are the Melidids, and I've only recently found Melidids in the pine bush myself. There's not very many Melidids around at all. In fact, there's 3 species pictured here, and those are the only 3 species in this family that we're likely to find in this area. So the top 2 are Macropus, and they actually specialize in loosestrifes. So loosestrifes actually, instead of producing nectar, produce a floral oil. And these guys use that floral oil to waterproof their nest. The other one down here is Melita ichordii. It's a possibility to see around here. We have not seen it yet. It specializes on deerberry. And here's just a picture of Macropus. You can see here's those pollen baskets back here. She's holding those back. And this is a loosestrife flower that she's visiting to get some of those floral oils. All right, so we made it to the meat here. talking about, I want to bring up the bee research that we have conducted and that is ongoing in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. So just some of the questions that we've been interested in looking at with this work is, you know, when I first started here in 2010, there wasn't a list of bees. We had no idea what bees were here. We had no idea what really constituted that bee community. And so I just wanted to know what was in the pine bush. Pine barrens are known for being hot spots, especially for invertebrates. And so I suspected that we had an interesting bee community here. And then I was interested in kind of looking at some of the effects of our management. So in 2010, we looked at a mow and herbicide treatment and whether that affected the bee community. And some of the ongoing projects that we have right now is we're looking to see if we're seeing any shifts or changes in the bee community over time. And finally, most recently, we joined a regional study looking at pollinators in xeric habitats. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about those. But first, I just wanted to bring up sampling techniques for bees. Unfortunately, because bees are so diverse and because a lot of the characters that we're using to identify species are microscopic. So you need to actually look at a bee under a microscope in order to identify it to species. It's not like going birding where you can get out your bird guide and you can identify field marks and then look at your bird guide and identify it. We need to actually look at them under a scope. And sometimes those microscopic characters that we're using to identify them are very, very subtle between species. And so sampling for bees is destructive, meaning that we collect specimens. So the ways that we do that are, this is targeted netting, hand netting, or sweep netting. This is usually done on like a timed sweep net. I do sweep nets for about 30 minutes. And I'm focusing on catching bees. Yeah, it doesn't have to be some guy from the 70s. Anybody can do that. The other big technique that we use is called pan trapping or bowl trapping. And these are just colored bowls. In fact, the bowls that we use now actually are painted with ultraviolet paint. And so the bees are attracted to them because they think it's a flower. They have this soapy water in them. The soap breaks the surface tension, so the bees fall into the water. We leave these out for a day. I usually put mine out in the morning and pick them up in the evening. Yeah, and then you clean up those specimens and pin them. Our final technique, which is this is called a malaise trap, and it's a really good kind of general technique for catching any kind of insect. And what happened? Well, you can see it kind of looks like a tent. And it's got like an H shape. So it's got this wall kind of going along the white part of the tent, and then it's got two walls going perpendicular. So what happens is when an insect is flying through the habitat, they kind of hit one of these walls, and their natural inclination is to fly up to try and get out. Also looks lighter up, that's why the top of it is white. And they end up flying up into this little collection jar at the top of the tent. So those are the main ways that we study bees, that we collect them. So this first study that was conducted in 2010, it was published in the Journal of Insect Conservation and Diversity. And this was looking at bee diversity in scrapbook patches 2 years after mow and herbicide treatment. So mow and herbicide treatment was a technique that we use here at the Pine Bush to get control of scrub oak. So with fire suppression for so many years in the Pine Bush, we were finding that the scrub oak was so well established that we really could not knock it back enough to let some of our other native plants get a hold. And so instead of having this nice heterogeneous looking landscape where we had a scrub oak here and a lupin plant here and a New Jersey tay plant here and a world loosestrife here, what we were seeing is just a monoculture of scrub oak thicket, which really kind of isn't good for a lot of things. It's not a very diverse habitat. It doesn't provide a lot of niches for animals. And so in the interest of trying to thin that back out and get it to more what would have happened if fire hadn't been suppressed, we actually did a mow and herbicide treatment where we mowed the scrub oak down and then applied some herbicide to one of every 3 clumps at 4 sites. And so what I did is I went in and I pan trapped and I sweep netted in those 4 sites. 2 years after this mow and herbicide treatment. And I also sampled in a site that hadn't received any mow and herbicide treatment and compared those to see if there was any effect on the bee community. So this was the results. So this was the first study of bees in the preserve, the first list of bees in the preserve. I found 87 species of bees in just over 1,100 specimens that were collected. You can see I didn't find that Melidid family. I hadn't seen that quite yet. Here are the 4 sites here. So this brown one is our control site that hadn't received any treatment. And then these 4 green sites are our treatment sites. And just looking at the richness, so the richness is just the number of species, and then the abundance is just the number of individual bees captured. There's not really anything there. They all look very, very similar. So we did a couple different statistical analyses to try and figure this out. One of them is doing multi-dimensional scaling, which kind of just puts your data out there in space. And if there are any patterns, you would expect your data to kind of clump up. So if we thought that our communities of bees in these treated sites were distinctly different from our control sites, we would expect those sites to kind of group up in this space that we've created here. And we didn't see that. You can kind of see, so here's our sites over here, and they're everywhere. There's really no pattern. But what you do see a little bit is an effect of time. So that bee community is maybe more affected by time, so time of year that we conducted the sample, than it is by the treatment. So in order to kind of tease out that effect of time, we went and did this other analysis called a blocked multi-response permutation procedure. And I have that written in my notes because there's no way I'm going to remember that, MRPP. And basically what this does is it's kind of pulling out that time, so then we can look at the effect of the treatment. So down here on the x-axis, in these first 4, you'll see that we're comparing our control site to our 4 treatment sites. And on the green box here, we're comparing our treatment sites to each treatment site. So on the red, we're comparing the controls to the treatments, and in the green, we're comparing the treatments to the treatments. And what we see with these is that our difference between the control and the treatment sites is greater than the difference between the treatment sites. So the treatment sites are more similar to each other than they are to the control site, which does suggest that there is some kind of community difference between the control site and these treatment sites. So ultimately what we found is that the pine bush has this high diversity of bees and also wasps. We also added wasps into this study, and we didn't see any negative evidence of a negative effect 2 years post this treatment. In fact, it's more likely that it was positive because the sampling in the control area actually sampled more open areas. I sampled along trails and fire breaks, and so that might have artificially kind of bumped up what we would have seen in that scrub oak thicket if I had gotten down on my hands and knees and pushed through that scrub oak. And that effect is likely at the species level, so it's likely has to do with more floral resources, more open habitat for nesting, and so maybe we're seeing more sand specialists and more pollen specialists. So that other research that's still ongoing, so please stay tuned because I'm very excited to if and when, no, not if, when this research is completed, presenting again. So this is working with the New York State Museum, specifically the curator of entomology at the New York State Museum, Tim McCabe, and a volunteer, Sam Adams. Tim McCabe did an overall survey of insects in the pine bush in the early 80s. And he did that using these malaise traps because he wanted a general survey. He wasn't focusing on one particular taxa. He just wanted to sample the insects in general. And so he has bee specimens from that research. He did not identify them, but they are at the museum. And I have started identifying those specimens. And now we have started redoing this to a small degree. We have one site that we know was sampled as part of the 1980 study, and we're sampling that site again moving forward so that we can compare the bee community like 40 or 50 years. Has it changed over 40 or 50 years? And there's a good chance that it has because we do have records. I have found specimens in the collection for the pine bush for the rusty patch bumblebee, as well as some other rare bumblebees. Like this is Bombus ashtoni, which is a parasitic bumblebee, and specifically a parasitic on the rusty patch bumblebee. So there's a very good chance that we're going to see shifts in our in the community of bees, and I'm very curious to see if we'll see that in other families or other taxa. The other big bee research that we recently just joined is the pollinator RCN project. So this was a regional conservation needs grant, a federal grant that was given to look at pollinators in xeric habitats. So that's what that green is on this map, and it's focused on the northeast. So the green are highlighting pine barrens, oak woodlands, and glades. So xeric habitats are usually like nutrient poor, don't water, not a lot of moisture, usually sandy soils. And these black dots are areas on the map where frosted elfin is documented, and that's a butterfly that feeds exclusively on wild blue lupin, which is really closely tied with these xeric habitats. So the idea here is to create this regional network to coordinate management and monitoring, and to share best management practices for pollinators in xeric habitats. So our data is going to contribute to this larger understanding of pollinators in these xeric habitats in the Northeast, but also here at the Pine Bush, we're looking at that bee response again to management, but this time we're looking at mow and prescribed burn treatment as opposed to the mow and herbicide treatment. So that study is ongoing. Last year was our second year of data collection. So I collected bees, and we also did surveys of the vegetation in our sites. So that's another big project that we're very happy to be a part of and excited to see what we find. In the meantime, the answer you all have been waiting for since the beginning of the lecture, I have found 174 species. So for the 14 of you, I think it was 14 that said 174, good on you. It is 174, and that number is still going up. I just started identifying my bees that I collected this past summer, and I almost immediately got 2 new species of Melidids. So it is fun. And I do expect that number to keep going up. But some interesting discoveries that we found so far. This little bee up here is a tiny, tiny little bee. This is Lasioglossum bureki, and this is a sand specialist. So this is a species that's probably one of the most common bees here in the pine bush, but it can't be found outside of sandy soil. So if you were to go anywhere else in New York State and look for this bee, you wouldn't be able to find it. In fact, John Asher was a bee researcher who worked at the American Museum of Natural History down in New York City until recently, and he looked for this bee and wasn't able to find it in New York State, but it's one of our most common species here at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. Similarly, over here, there's 2 more sand specialists. This is Andrina bricata and Nomata electa. These are more coastal species, so they hadn't been found this far inland, which is really interesting because, I mean, coastal, you know, you think of sandy soils, and that's what we have here. So these species that we may have thought were strictly coastal were actually sand specialists. We also got a New York State record for Nomata tiftonensis, which had not been found in the state before. And so most of the time you find new species, it's exciting. This little guy down here, Hylaeus pictypes, is one of our yellow-faced bees. This one is not that, I mean, it's exciting because it's a New York State record, but it's also a species introduced from Europe. So not super great. We do have about probably between 5 and 10 species of introduced bee. And to my knowledge, we have not found evidence of them negatively affecting our native pollinators. So they have not been classified as invasive per se, but we do have non-native species, and Hylaeus pictypes is one of those. 2 of my other favorite finds here, over on the right here, this is that Macropus. You may remember the Melidids. I said we only had 3 possible species to find here in this area. And Macropus ciliata is the one that I found. And I'm particularly interested in this because of this plant. So this plant is highly abundant in the pine bush. If you've been to the pine bush, you have seen this, I'm sure. This is world loosestrife. And I've always wondered what is pollinating world loosestrife, because I have never seen any insects on it. Whereas everything else that's flowering at the time is buzzing, I've never seen anything at the world loosestrife. So having caught now this Macropus, I'm very curious if that is what is in fact pollinating this world loosestrife. It makes sense because they specialize on the loosestrifes, and this loosestrife doesn't have any nectar. Again, it produces those floral oils, and so it really has this very close relationship with this Macropus. The other one here, I was excited to find. Look how cute this little bee is. It's adorable. This is Anthidiellum notatum. It's the northern rotund resin bee. And it's another kind of leafcutter bee, except it's very unique. It uses plant resins to make almost like a little pot that it sticks to vegetation. So it has a very unique way of nesting. So these are some of our exciting finds, some of my favorites. And now just to conclude for tonight, I just want to tell you guys what you can do for your bees at home. So what do bees need? They need pollen, they need nectar, and they need a place to nest. So those are the three things you need to make sure that you're providing. So for floral resources, you want to make sure that you have an abundance and diversity. That's better. You're gonna attract generalists that will get good nutrition feeding on a lot of things, and you're going to attract possibly some of those specialists that only feed on a few kinds of plants. You really want to focus on native plants, again, as mentioned before, because those exotic plants didn't evolve with the pollinators that we have here. So there's a chance that they aren't able to access the resources in those exotic plants. And sometimes those exotic plants, the nectar and pollen that they're getting from it is not as nutritious. So you really want to focus on native. A good mix of everything, perennial versus annual. There's been some research on perennials being able to produce more nutritious pollen and nectar because they're more of an established plant, whereas the annuals, they grow up from seed every year. So they may not be as nutritious for the bees, but it's a good idea to have a mix. And it's really important to have a season-long supplies, because bees are going to be flying all season. You're going to have turnover in which species are flying, but you want to make sure that you have the resources that they need all year long. And again, for the nesting sites, again, bees differ in how they nest. So it could be as much as just leaving some bare ground for the ground nesters. You can buy these bee hotels or bee nests. Some of them are just bundles of bamboo. Some of them actually have tubes that you can pull out every year and replace. And sometimes they're just pieces of wood that have different size holes drilled into them. So these are all different ways that you can provide. And a lot of these bee nests are commercially available. It used to be, you had to kind of scrounge, and I used to cut up Phragmites, which is that big grass that grows in wetlands. It's also invasive, but it has hollow stems, and you could just bundle that up. But now many of these bee houses are commercially available. And with that, I think I will take some questions. I'm going to leave my email address up here, guys. Please write it down. Please feel free to ask me questions. That's one of my favorite games, is for somebody to ask me to identify something for them. So feel free to send me pictures of insects, or if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask me.
So thank you so much, Amanda. This was really awesome. And we have 3 questions so far, so we welcome a few more. The first one is from Darwin. I have a lot of holes bored in the wood of my roof eaves. Are they chewing and digesting the wood fiber, or just making a cavity to live in? And he adds, how do I control or discourage them, or should I just let them eat?
So they aren't eating the wood, they're spitting it out. They're not actually eating it. They are excavating. And I've had a lot of people ask me how to control them. If you have treated lumber, a lot of times they'll drill in and then get grossed out and leave. So you could put cover it with a piece of treated lumber. But I have honestly seen them also just eat through treated lumber too. So it's kind of a losing battle. I haven't heard of anybody's like losing structural integrity from them. I would assume that at some point it could happen, but I haven't heard of anybody's like roof falling down because of carpenter bees. But usually what I say is peaceful coexistence is the best way to go. You could supply them with other nesting resources, just stack some wood in the backyard and hope that they find that more appealing. That's the best I got.
So the next question is from Anonymous. What type of pine bush habitat is the most diverse for bees? Are there projected estimates of species that you are still expecting to find?
That's a good question. So yeah, I would say that the habitat that's best for the bees is that habitat that's not, it's like a shrubby grassland or a grassy shrubland, is what Neil always says. So it's got clumps of scrub oak, but it's got a lot of spaces in between the scrub oaks where all the more herbaceous plants can grow. And that not only provides a lot of floral resources, but it also provides a lot of microclimates for nesting for both ground nesters and cavity nesters. So leaving standing deadwood is good. So I'd say in the pine bush, so our highest quality pine barrens is probably the best for the bees. So that would be, you know, like back behind the Discovery Center, the Truex Trail barrens off of Kings Road. That's some of our most highest quality pine barrens.
And the other part was, are there any projected estimates of species are you hoping to find or expecting to find?
There's a few that I have on my list that I've seen, for example, at my research at my field site for my master's that I haven't seen here yet. But again, it is a very kind of unique habitat. And so there are some species that I would expect to find other places and not find here. So for example, I guess I'm not expecting to find 400 species of bees. I'm not expecting to find all 400 New York bees here at the Pine Bush. And especially because a lot of them are probably in other specialized type habitats. So I don't know, I guess I haven't really thought about where that number would, certainly we're leveling off, but I would think that we could probably hit 200 species.
The next question is, what percentage of cross-pollination occurs by wind and rainwater? That's also from Darwin.
Darwin, I don't know the percentage. I don't know the percentage. I guess if it's 75% are pollinated by insects, then it's probably 25% are pollinated by wind, wind and rain. But then again, even the ones that don't require, like I said, even the ones that don't require insect pollination sometimes are pollinated by insects, and because they're getting that cross pollination, they're producing more viable seeds. So I think that's tough. That's tough. I'm not sure.
Here's a one for you. What inspired you to study bees?
Well, I've always been kind of interested in insects. And I've done a little bit of insects kind of my whole life. And honestly, when I started my master's research, bees was kind of a very hot topic. Bees was just starting to be kind of, we were just starting to be concerned about them. We were just starting to be interested in them. And it was a completely new group for me to start working with. And so that was a little bit daunting because it's like learning a new language when you learn to work with a different group of insects, because you have to learn all different morphologies and all different kinds of terms and names for things. So yeah, I guess it was the potential for learning and contributing to an understanding of a species that's so important.
Our next question is from Darwin. How much bee mortality occurs by lawnmowers that have vacuuming features? And how guilty, I'll add that, how guilty should we feel for using one?
You know, I'm not sure, but if you're mowing your lawn, if you're mowing grass, you probably don't have a lot of pollinators out there anyway. So I would say if you're mowing like grass, you're not killing many bees. If you have like natural meadow in your yard that you're mowing every year and to maintain, I would say you could time your mowing so that you had the least impact on the bees. And so you could mow those in the winter time or late in the season or very early in the season.
Our next question is from Jennifer Ford. Leafcutter bees. Do they make smaller holes that look like they were made with a hole punch, or is that something else?
No, yeah, that could be them. That could be them. It always comes, it's not going to be in the middle of the leaf. It's always going to be cut into the leaf. But yeah, there are different size leafcutter bees, and they will cut different size leaves. So a smaller leafcutter bee will cut a different size circle out of the leaf.
The next question is from Johanna Garrison. I have read the male carpenter bee is very protective of his mate's nest. Is this true? And that would make him a partial caretaker, no?
I haven't ever heard them referred to as protective. They do patrol a lot outside the nests. I guess I'd have to do some more research to find out if what they were doing was protecting the nest or if they were waiting for females to come out to mate. And they will, I mean, if they've got a place where there's a bunch of females mating, they're going to defend it from other males. So I don't know that can be really classified as parental care. But it does definitely happen. And actually the picture that I have up here with the questions is a male carpenter bee. You can recognize them because they have the yellow on the face. Richard said it looks like a Post-it note, which is totally true. It's fun actually, because the males can't sting, right? So if you're standing there and there's these males kind of flying in your face, I like to just kind of swat them or try to catch them and let them go. I just mess with them a little bit sometimes.
The next question is from Abigail Riza. Is there any way we can support bee conservation while living in urban areas?
Yes, actually, there's been a lot of research, and John Asher did a lot of work when he was down at the American Museum of Natural History, looking at the bee community, like right in the city. And it was surprising what he was able to get, the bees that they were able to find right in New York City, because people had these tiny little pollinator gardens. And so, yeah, you can provide pollinator habitat even in cities. By just having like window boxes, or encouraging your landlord, or if you have some land, you can plant natives, or you have a little pot garden of native plants. You will find that the bees, it's kind of a if you build it, they will come kind of situation.
The next question is anonymous. I had a nest of bees in the ground last year and had to leave that area all summer into fall. I'm right near the pine bush. Should I just leave them alone?
Okay, so probably what you had was yellow jackets, because there's really no bees that nest communally in the ground like that. I mean, bumblebees are social and will nest, but my guess is that you probably had yellow jackets, which is actually a wasp. And the good news is in the north, they don't survive from year to year. In the south, that colony would keep developing and could get bigger and bigger and bigger. But up here in the north, they actually don't survive the winter. The only part of a colony that survives the winter is a gravid queen. And she is not necessarily going to go find that nest again. So now is a good time to actually go fill in that hole so that another wasp doesn't find it next year and create a new nest. So whatever was there is gone now. Certainly in the winter, they don't survive the winter. So you could fill in that hole and prevent them from nesting there again.
The Next question is from Denise Hackard-Stoner. I noticed cut brush along the red and yellow trail at Blueberry Hill West this week, and a large sign about pesticides being used. What pesticides are used?
So I think that in Blueberry Hill, yes, in Blueberry Hill, that is a company that is treating some overabundant woodies out in Blueberry Hill. So I think they'll be treating Japanese honeysuckle, probably also fire cherry, I think, is also getting treated out there. And it is, so what they're using is Roundup. And so what they do is kind of a clip and drip or a stump, what do they call it? Clip and drip, or I can't remember the other name for it, but basically what they do is they cut down the shrub and then they drip this herbicide onto the stump so that it gets pulled down, and it minimizes by spray and non-target effects.
Next question is from Carrie. Kaylin would like to know, what is a bee's predator?
Ooh, that's a good question. So there's a lot of things that'll eat bees like opportunistically, just because they're little sausages with wings. But there are some things that actually do specialize on bees. So I didn't mention tonight that in addition to social bees and solitary bees, there's also social wasps and solitary wasps. So we just talked about yellow jackets. That's a social wasp. There are a lot of solitary wasps, and they have life history strategies kind of similar to the bees, except for the fact that they're not stocking their nests with pollen. They're stocking their nests with a prey item. And there are wasps called bee wolves that will hunt down and stock their nest with bees. And then once they get enough bees in their nest, they will lay an egg, and then that wasp larva will hatch and eat those bees. But certainly lots of vertebrates will take advantage of them, and especially if they're able to find a nest. Bee grubs are like hot dogs and sausages, you know, so if they can find the nest, they'll take that out. So that's another, you know, it's good advantage to being solitary, is it's not really worth a predator's time to hunt down one singular nest.
Next question is from Johanna Garrison. What's your take on the European wool carder bee? To what extent is their invasive status? I named mine Bruiser last summer. Boy, was he zealous.
I love the wool carder bees. I think they're adorable. For everybody else, the wool carder bees are so called because they actually harvest the pubescence, so like the hairs on plants. They will scrape those hairs off, and they'll take that mass of little plant hairs back to their nest, and that's kind of what they'll use to line their nest. So they're also really adorable. They look very similar to, let's see, they look really similar to this Anthidiellum here. I don't think there is any evidence of negatively impacting native species. We do have native species of Anthidium. So to my knowledge, I have not heard anything about them negatively impacting. And I haven't seen them in enough number to think that they would have a terrible impact.
Next question is from Carrie. You mentioned honeybees cannot pollinate certain flowers because their heads do not trigger the pollen to fall. Is that because of their size?
Yeah, it does have to do with their size. And also sometimes honeybees and even other bees will also cheat. If they can't get their heads into the flower, they'll chew into the side of the flower to get the nectar rewards. And so they'll get the nectar without ever getting any pollen. So that's something the honeybees could also be doing, is cheating. But yes, it does have to do with their physical size.
The next question is from Jen. Is there volunteer opportunity to help with bee identification if you have experience in insect ID?
Who was this again?
Jen?
Jen, why don't you shoot me an email, and we'll go from there. It's possible. It is, I will say it is, it takes a lot of work because it is learning a new language, because there are many structures. When you're looking at a bee under a microscope, there are many structures. And even I still have to look things up sometimes. What are you talking about? But yeah, why don't you shoot me an email?
Next question is from Johanna Garrison. Thank you for the information about the commercially managed eastern bumblebee. Can you recommend a good source or two for further research?
Google. I can't think of anything offhand. Trying to think. We don't have a whole lot of resources. We did have a lot of bee people in New York State, and we've kind of lost some of them. But if you were interested in bumblebees in particular, the Xerces Society, you could look up the Xerces Society. They run a program called Bumblebee Watch, where they're using community scientists to help them collect data on occurrences of bumblebee species. The problem with it is that it's not super well supported on the East Coast, but certainly they would be able to provide you with some good information and about bumblebees. That might be a good place to start. And that's Xerces is Xerces, Xerces.
Next question is from Zachary Benedusi. Do you tend to find many European honeybees when collecting? I worked on a project out in North Dakota, and we tended to get very high honeybee catch compared to native species, though the areas were quite heavily dominated and surrounded by agriculture.
Yeah, we do see them. I would say I don't see them a lot. They're certainly out there, but I wouldn't say that they're outnumbering the native bees. And they're probably most likely feral colonies. So I should have mentioned that honeybees, in addition to being regularly managed and maintained as livestock, they've also kind of become naturalized. They've escaped and become naturalized. So we don't have any sources around the pine bush for honeybees. So my assumption is that what we're seeing are these naturalized honeybees. So I would guess that the reason you were seeing so many at your site was because you had so much agriculture around.
Next question is from Tim and Julia. How are the pine bush bees spending the winter? Hibernation, migration?
That's an excellent question. Good question. So they're here. Most of them, so some of them, so all of those ones, remember I said that the queens or the females will dig out those nests, they'll stalk the nest, lay an egg. So that egg hatches over the course of the summer. That egg is going to hatch and eat the food resource that she's gathered. And it's going to grow and grow and grow. And then finally it's going to pupate. So a lot of people don't really think, because you think about cocoons and chrysalises, you think about monarchs, you think about butterflies, but bees and wasps are actually also what we call holometabolists. So they have complete metamorphosis. So they have that pupal stage. And so some of the bees are overwintering in that pupal stage. And some of them will hatch out and overwinter as adults. And so they're in their nests, basically. So they haven't emerged. They got laid by their mom in that nest, and they're not going to come out of that nest until this year, until this season this year. The bumblebees are a little bit different. Well, so the honeybees are the socials. Those will actually survive. So those, a feral hive of honeybees can actually survive the winter. And what they do is they kind of make this ball, this mass, and they'll actually move around. And so the middle of that ball will be very, very warm, and they'll slowly shift around the bees so that the ones on the outside aren't staying on the outside the whole time. And so they'll kind of turn that mass of bees around to maintain a core temperature that will keep all of the bees alive. For the bumblebees, the only part that's overwintering, life stage that's overwintering are gravid queens. So these are queens that have mated the previous fall, and they crawled under some bark or down in an old mouse hole or something. And yeah, so it's kind of the insect equivalent of hibernation, I guess.
So we have 6 more questions. We should be able to finish that up by 8:30.
Okay.
The next question is Miss Daryl McGrath. I have a butterfly bush in my yard and the bumblebees love it. I understand that it is a non-invasive, non-native species. Sorry. Should I pull it up?
I wouldn't pull it up. I don't think it's hurting the bumblebees. I don't know if any research has been done on the quality of that, but if you have other nectar and pollen resources in the yard, then it's probably fine. It's, you know, it's just one, you know, and I agree, they do seem to really, everybody seems to love butterfly bush. So no, I wouldn't take it up. I think it's fine.
Next question is anonymous again. Do you think it's possible to replace honeybees' jobs by increasing native pollinator habitat?
Yeah, I think that's a big question right now. I think we have demonstrated that it is possible, but I think the issue is this issue of scale. So in order to provide enough habitat for enough pollinators to successfully pollinate our crops, yeah, I think that's what's in question right now. And I think that's the source of a lot of ongoing research right now. I think we know that, yes, they could. We know that we could get the same fruit set, the same size fruits, and in many cases, they do a better job. But the question is whether or not we can provide them enough habitat. It might mean that we have to decrease the amount of agricultural land so that we can make sure that we are providing enough for the native bees. But I think that's still in question. I think we're not quite sure yet. I certainly hope so. That's my hope, is that, you know, and we might need to switch away from this monoculture. We might need to just rethink our whole system of agriculture where we have hundreds of thousands of acres, all the same plant. You know, we might need to rethink our whole system of agriculture. I hope it's possible. I think that's a good reason to support local farms, and because most likely those local farms are providing habitat for pollinators, and a good portion of their pollination service is coming from native pollinators.
Next question is from Joel Hanford. I have bees that live in the sand between the stones on my patio. They become much larger in number as the year goes on.
Okay.
They bring leaves into the ground with them and are a gray color. They are not at all aggressive. What could they be?
Huh. They're bringing leaves into the ground. Are you sure they're leaves and not some kind of insect? I guess I'm wondering if it's possible. We have some of the sand wasps will specialize on shield bugs, so maybe that looks like a leaf when they're bringing it in. It's hard for me to know just from that description. If you could get a picture or even a video, please send it to me. I'm very interested too. I love that you coexist with them. Thank you for coexisting with them.
A couple more questions. What species causes those oak galls?
Ooh, that's a good question. There are so many things that cause galls on oaks. And those are either going to be wasps, very specialized gall wasps, or in some cases they're flies, but I think for the most part on oaks that they're wasps. Not wasps that can sting you. They're very, very, very tiny, tiny, tiny wasps. But yeah, it's some kind of wasp.
Jim Dillon asks, what is the most populous bee in the pine bush?
Ooh, I might say Lasioglossum vierecki, that beautiful little golden yellow bee, that sand specialist, if I was to pick a species. But we also do have a lot, it would be a toss-up, I think, between that and we have a lot of one of those small carpenter bees. Ceratina strenua is extremely numerous in the pine bush, or at least it was this past year. So, oh yeah, I'd probably say it'd be Ceratina strenua, Laziglossum bureki. Algochlora aurata is also that's another halictid, one of those nice race car green halictids, is also very common. So there's your top 3, is my guess.
So the last 2, Dillon, are really more thank yous. I'm a member of Xerces. This was from Joanna Garrison. She's already a member of Xerces and registered for the Bumblebee Watch.
Oh,
They
good.
had a huge turnout, and thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Joanna.
And finally, Laura Davis writes, we have started a pollinator group on Facebook for the Capital District to encourage each other to create beautiful gardens to help conserve native bees. We are this is a quote, the Capital District Pollinator Allies. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to look that up. Capital District
Pollinator Allies.
Pollinator Allies. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think if we can provide a lot of habitat for bees, for our native pollinators, if we just get rid of these weird green lawn things. All right.
So, thank you so much. I'm signing out to you, Dillon.
All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, so much.